Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Wilken, and I'm Vice President of Avnet EMENA's Supply Chain Solutions team. My colleague, who you'll see in a little bit, Douglas Kent, is VP for Supply Chain Business Development and leads our Avnet Velocity team. And so I'd like to welcome you to the first of a series of supply chain seminars being provided to you by Avnet during this Electronica week. If you check the Electronica website, you can see the times and topics for the other presentations this week. Today, Doug and I will be presenting on supply chain. It's still a risky business, supply chain trends and risk management for 2013. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the general supply chain landscape. In the past decade and decades, we've seen a growth in business opportunities from innovation, new products and services, and access to new markets. In the pursuit of these opportunities, we have heightened our complexity, required faster time to service or to market with broader geographic reach within inside of our supply chains, all while trying to optimize the business bottom line. If you look at this slide, I think you can relate to many of these challenges that you're seeing in your own supply chain. Each could be more or less important for you based on your business situation and the needs of your customers. So with these new challenges, the needs to improve your ability to manage the supply chain and change our supply chain models has increased in importance in order to survive and thrive in the global business environment. In addition, the value of supply chain and great supply chain management has evolved from being just about material management to the unlocking of competitive abilities that can influence all financial metrics and increase the value for all stakeholders, customer, supplier, employee, and shareholders. Of course, as you look up here, the typical metrics around better capital management are impacted by good supply chain practice. But leaders in the market are using supply chain to create new offerings around better service models, which in turn create top-line value for companies today. It's no surprise that some of the leading companies in the world today are leaders in supply chain management. As a reference point, you can check the yearly AMR studies about great supply chains and global leaders to see how well these correspond amongst each other. These companies have linked business strategy with their underlying supply chain strategy to win in their chosen markets. So, in order to create a mature supply chain which delivers to you and your customers economic, service, and ecologic benefits, you need to start developing a series of interlocking capabilities that, when in place, will start providing you competitive advantage. Let's see what we got here. Let's just blow it all up. In the years since the tech bubble, there's been a lot of work done on supply chain visibility, and more will continually need to be done. If we look at the Japan earthquake, that showed us how it wasn't just about knowing what product was inside of your pipeline, but also how important it was to know the origin of your products and where it was being produced. Once we have this visibility, we should then have a chance to better spot the risk inside of our supply chain, and then we need to do something about it. The more we master this process, the more we move towards a sustainable supply chain and gain a share of the aforementioned benefits. The journey, let's see if we can get this to work. Hello. Starts with visibility, and then it moves to supply chain predictability, which is the next stage what we're talking about with inside of risk and risk management. And then it moves onwards to sustainability, which is really the end game that we're playing for at this point in time, which should allow you to gain these economic and ecological and service benefits. So today's focus is about risk. So it's not enough to just have visibility on risk, as there's a lot of potential risks out there. What is really needed is supply chain management is a systemic identification, assessment, and qualification of potential supply chain risk with the objective to control or reduce its negative impact upon your supply chain performance. Now, your potential disruptions can come from a couple of areas. They can come from you internally, so we're talking about your suppliers, your plant and equipment, for example, or it can be outside of your supply chain, as we've seen of recent with factors like economy or floods. Then you need to be developing key strategies to manage this determined risk. And those strategies are around controlling, mitigating, reducing, and eliminating your risk. For those of you who are also involved in business continuity planning, it's very similar in approach because, again, here you are trying to ensure the continuity of your supply chain. So, where do your risks come from? Well, they span the breadth of your end-to-end supply chain, from your suppliers of raw components, of raw materials, components, and manufacturing, to your own internal operational risks, and outward to those connected to your customers and in turn to their end customers. An important concept to keep in mind is the interlinkage across the supply chain. Where one part fails, the rest of the supply chain can fail in a chain reaction. It's also important to understand what are the risks of your end customer. You're developing your supply chain to go ahead and support those end customers. If you understand their risk, you then have a chance to understand what risks you need to cope with and avoid, mitigate, or control. You also need to understand where are the weakest links in your chain that need a strategy to control, mitigate, reduce, or eliminate. So which factors should you be considering? There are numerous large factors that you could impact your supply chain performance, and what should be thinking broadly across the chain, inclusive of your supply chain partners. Keep in mind the actual risk could be a mixture of these factors that ultimately can create a disruption in your supply chain. A key part of your process as well needs to be that you're continuously challenging yourself about what are your risk factors. We often work on fixing the problems we know, but we don't work very hard on solving the problems that may be the risks of the future. As we look back over the supply chain disruptions of the last 3 or 4 years, we see that risk is a moving target. And we need with new topics each year, which then applies to the fact that we need to be thinking constantly about what new risks are inside of our supply chain. So now, a simple example on risk and risk preparedness. So, for which of these scenarios do you and your business know what to do? For which of these scenarios do you have a contingency plan which you can put in place so that your operations is up and running again within a specific amount of time? Which of these scenarios would have the most impact on your business? Now, the first scenario has happened to us all. And the second one, around a production line equipment failure, for example, may have happened to a few of us. And then I probably would have said a couple of years ago, something like a semiconductor supplier having a serious fire, I would have said was very rare. But as we all know, many of us have had to react to the issues with the semiconductors from Japan, hard disk drives from Thailand, where this would have been the rare occurrence that now we actually need a plan. So, how many of us had this on our potential risk factors in our risk management planning? What's probably true for the most of us is usually there's a standard operating procedure that exists for dealing with the first two issues, but often we don't have the contingency plans to deal with a third problem. And the third one is usually the one that's the most critical and potentially harder to deal with because it's complex and it may even require that we have to spend money to deal with it. But it's like an insurance policy. You need to have something like this because it could be vital for your survival. You only need to look at what happened with the Japanese component manufacturers in the time of the earthquake and how we were all having expectations that they would be unable to produce within a matter of months. But it was the plans that they had in place that they secured their supply chain and got it back going. I would also say it was a credit to the industry in that time of the disaster on how well people collaborated with each other to keep the supply chain moving. That said, we are in many cases very lucky. And that is probably not how you wish to run your supply chain based on luck. As a final point, from my side, just identifying a risk is not good enough. You need to be sensing and looking for risks inside of your supply chain. Do you have a process for systemically and continuously scanning your supply chain for potential risks? How deep can you peer into your supply chain? Today's supply chains can have second and third tier suppliers that are supplying you the smallest things in the world, like industrial fasteners that might be needed to build a Boeing Dreamliner. And if you do not have these, you cannot build your plane. And how does your system provide information to you? How quickly can it do that? How do you respond when this incident happens? This sensing piece is the next step that we see in building the more mature supply chain. Now, I would like to turn this presentation over to Douglas to speak more about how do you determine your key risks and how do you do something about managing them. Douglas?
Thank you. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face, of course, when looking at the opportunity to mitigate risk is actually how to measure risk. So that's what I'd like to share a little bit with you now. Oop, maybe not. Going back. So one of the things we examined within the community called the Supply Chain Council. I don't know how many of you might be actually aware of the Supply Chain Council, but one of the things that we examined within the Risk Special Interest Group is actually quantifying risk. This is considerably one of the challenges that we face and we find a lot of difficulty in, is not only identifying risk but also measuring risk. So we've adopted a measure that actually comes to us from the financial community, and that measure is called VAR. That's called value at risk. And what we do in VAR as in terms of a measurement is actually take a look at two aspects of risk. The first is the probability of the risk, and the second is the potential impact of that particular risk to our business. Those two in combination, when applied together, give us a quantifiable measurement called value at risk. Why is it important for us to quantify the risk? Because you can imagine that, as Brian just showed you, there are so many risks that potentially could add disruption to our supply chain. We must focus on those risks which have the highest VAR. So that guides our thinking in terms of how we would prioritize these risks. So let's take a look at a couple of examples, because it's not quite as intuitive as you might initially think. So we try to use an example that most of you are probably familiar with. If those of you are like us and fly around a lot, then you recognize that if we just took a simplistic view and took a look at, for example, different airlines' performance in terms of their on-time delivery, if you will, the on-time delivery of you to your destination. We can look at three examples here, just for simplistic purposes, taking a look at three airlines, Delta, Northwest, and American, for example. And we took a look at their percentage of lateness. So an example, similar to you might think about in terms of on-time delivery. You can see that Delta Airlines, for example, is a percentage of late 19.66%. Not great, but not so bad. Take a look at two other examples, Northwest and American. You can see both of those, for example, very similar in terms of their percentage of lateness, about 31%. So initially you might think, probably no degree of differential between those two, but if I took a look at the options I had in front of me, I might choose, if I was concerned about on time, I might choose Delta, for example. Now, of course, that's, if you will, the probability aspect. Now we have to talk about the impact. So for the simplicity of the discussion, let's say, for example, that each minute late costs us $1. If we take a look at that, then we can start to do some calculations for basically simulating a value at risk measurement. If we took a look at the Delta example, we can see a degree of lateness. We can take a look at Northwest. We can apply the $1. We can see a degree of lateness. Remember, of course, that Northwest and American had a very similar percentage of lateness. But let's look at the summary of that. So percentage of lateness for Delta, for example, 20%. That equates to a VAR measure of just under 400,000. But then let's take a look at Northwest and American. Very similar percentages of lateness, but you see that the VAR measure for American Airlines, for example, is nearly twice that of Northwest. Why? because they had the very similar percentage of the degree of lateness, so very similar in terms of their probability, but the degree of lateness was much greater in American Airlines. In other words, when you were late, you were really late. So this, of course, has a very significant impact. So we use this just as a demonstration of how VAR works. So that's in essence one of the first challenges we have in a risk management program, is deciding how to quantify the risk. The second challenge we have is really trying to assess the degree of appetite that we as an organization have for risk. So also one of the things we have to remind ourselves of is that in most organizations, we don't have a supply chain, we have supply chains. There's an S on the end of that. And each of those supply chains operate distinctively. And what we mean by that is each of the attributes, potential attributes for those supply chains, may have a different level of focus for our organization. Think about the supply chains that you have in your organization, and think about these attributes. Think about the customer-facing attributes of reliability, responsiveness, and agility. So reliability meaning we did what we said we were going to do. In other words, we had perfect order fulfillment. Responsiveness is about the speed of our supply chain, taking a look at order fulfillment cycle time. And then agility, of course, is our ability to move up or down. We can move with changes in demand quite easily with minimal impact. Now take a look at internal attributes such as cost and asset utilization. If we take a look at our tolerance for risk, you can imagine that we have a different tolerance for risk if our focus was on reliability versus that of cost. Let me try and show you an example of that. So we have, as you can see on the left-hand side here, multiple supply chains, supply chain A, B, and C. If we take a look at those supply chains, take a look at the attributes associated with those supply chains, you can see very quickly in supply chain A that our superior focus, S stands for superior, that we want to be superior in our performance on reliability, which is different than supply chain B, for example, which has a strategy to be superior relative to cost. Now imagine that differential. I'm sure you can imagine in your own supply chains within your organization where you have those particular product groups or supply chains that compete on cost, and others where you absolutely have to be the leader in terms of reliability. If you take a look at risk, you can't apply risks across the organization in the same fashion. We can't paint every supply chain with the same brush. What we have to do is take a look at what's our strategy. If in supply chain A our strategy is on reliability, we have almost zero tolerance for risk, right? We can't afford not to be perfect. Whereas on cost, if we're focused on cost, we may not be able to build the redundancies for risk into our equation. In other words, we can't put that additional inventory in place because, in fact, we're competing on cost. To keep the cost down low, we may have a higher tolerance for risk. So be careful when you're taking a look at how you assess risk and the importance of risk across your organization. Be sure to use some degree of supply chain segmentation when you're thinking about it. We don't have a supply chain, we have supply chains. Those supply chains deserve to be treated individually, and that may mean that your strategy by supply chain may in fact be different. So that's the important messaging here. Now, how do we conquer this? So when we take a look at risk, one of the main aspects of building a sustainable supply chain is first to understand how your network works, how your network is optimized. It is surprising the number of organizations today that could not, for example, completely visualize the network of their supply chain. When we talk about network optimization, what we're focusing on here is building true competitive differentiation by understanding what-if capabilities or scenarios around what we would do to change our network if a particular scenario of risk manifested itself. Let's take, for example, I have an epicenter of production in an area which is either at geo or political risk. In that case, I'd want to look at how I would optimize my supply chain to avoid the risk. So when we take a look at supply chain risk as it relates to network optimization, the important factor here is first understand what your supply chain looks like, and then overlay your risks into that supply chain. Now here I'll talk about it in terms of not just understanding your tier 1 risks. So if we take a look at suppliers, we don't want to just look at our Tier 1 suppliers, but rather our Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers. There were a few organizations, I won't mention names, some of them have stands here, but there were a few organizations that when the Japan crisis happened, for example, at first glance, when they looked at their Tier 1, they thought, not at risk. I don't actually have any manufacturing facilities that were in jeopardy, etc. But when we looked at Tier 2, for example, then the risks were uncovered. So really understanding your network and its design at Tier 1 and beyond becomes an important differentiation here. The second aspect that I'd like to talk about is understanding cost to serve. So I won't take a poll of the people here today, but there are many people that I've met that actually have a very good understanding of their cost to serve. What does that actually mean? We're not talking about things like cost of goods sold. I dare say that every one of you would have an understanding of the cost of goods sold within your supply chains, but cost to serve is something that's quite different than that. When we talk about cost to serve, this is the cost associated with servicing every product to every customer. Now think about that. We know that we have specific customers that if we realized the cost to serve, that we would see actually differences in that number because they are, for example, more difficult to manage. Perhaps their forecast accuracy is less than desired. And as a result of that, we have higher costs within our business to serve that customer than we do other customers. So when we look at mitigating risk across the supply chain, we have to not only understand how our supply chain is operating, what that network looks like, but what does it cost to serve in that network? That way we can make the associated trade-offs. By understanding cost to serve, we have a great deal more insight to the decisions that we need to take relative to risk. The third aspect that I'll spend a little bit more time on, it's picking up on Brian's earlier address theme of building sustainable supply chains and dealing with getting an ROI-based visibility. So when we look to mitigate risk, if we take that VAR measure and we say this is what the potential probability and the impact is to our business, we need to compare that to what it costs us to mitigate. It is absolutely the case that we will identify risks that we will choose not to mitigate. Why? Because the ROI isn't there. In other words, the cost to mitigate is greater than the potential risk that that delivers to our organization. So we have to base that on ROI. In order to get that ROI basis, we have to return to that platform theme of before we can get to predictability, we first need to have visibility. And that visibility is something that we treat almost like it's an absolute, but most organizations today say they have limitations to their visibility of what's happening within their supply chain, either upstream or downstream, particularly again as we move into Tier 2 and Tier 3. So we need to regain that visibility of what's happening within our supply chain. If we can get the visibility of potential disruptions or risks in our supply chain, then we can gain the opportunity to decide which of those we want to mitigate. So we are developing within Avnet a solution to address that, and that solution is what we call the control tower. What the control tower does, if you can imagine a control tower like, again using an airline example, you can imagine that if you're moving from point A to point B, for example, you're going from San Francisco to Munich, you can imagine that at some point you may encounter something that may cause you to make a course correction. In other words, there's a storm front coming in, etc., and you need to change your course. The same is exactly true within the supply chain. There are times when we find out that there are potential disruptions in our supply chain that may cause us to change our course. The key of that, of course, is having that visibility so that we can predict the potential of those changes and decide to make a change to correct our course. And that solution is what we call control tower. And the control tower solution works both upstream and downstream once again and helps us gain that visibility. What you see in the center of a control tower is what we call a collaboration hub. If we want visibility, what it means is that our supply base and our customers and our channels have to contribute key supply chain data into this collaboration hub so that we can identify potentials for risk. This can be everything from extensions of lead time to shortages or allocations of a specific commodity, to changes in pricing, to currency fluctuations, to raising in transportation costs, to capacity constraints on moving materials from Asia into Europe, for example. All of these are potential risks that if we had the data within the control tower, particularly an OEM, for example, can make choices about how to mitigate the risk. And that becomes very important for us. So that solution is what we call the control tower, gaining that necessary visibility. So if we take a look at those aspects, we can summarize by taking these aspects away and talk about really gaining a clear understanding of the supply chain. So having a common language for our supply chain, being able to see that entire network, making sure that we understand the supply chain strategy. If we agree that supply chain strategy is only to support the overall business strategy, we need to make sure that our supply chain is built to support that strategy. Going back to that example about the attributes, if our business strategy is to compete on reliability, that gives us a different idea about how to manage risk in our supply chain than if, for example, we're trying to be superior associated with the cost attribute. So getting that business strategy importance is there. Also being able to measure the VAR. Identify your risks first. Now, if you want to focus on mitigation, the first thing you need to do is apply that VAR measure. Again, as a reminder, value at risk, or VAR, is the combination of the probability times the impact. So putting together that initial measure would give us an understanding of how to prioritize risks. Once we built the priority of the risk, then of course we can look at opportunities to mitigate. That sometimes means we need to challenge ourselves to be a little bit more innovative. If we want to tackle the aspect of risk, it means that we have to put together innovative solutions and invest in our supply chain capabilities. That investment in the supply chain capabilities means we have to build a formalized risk management program inside of our community. We have to build risk management as a core competency. That means, of course, that in building that as a core competency, we first must tackle things like gaining the important visibility upstream and downstream in our supply chain. Once we have the supply chain network understanding, we understand aspects of the supply chain like our key strategy for that supply chain. Once we can calculate things like cost to serve within the supply chain, then and only then can we start to think about how we best can mitigate the risk. So it's not an easy road, that's for sure. If it were easy, there would be a lot more people that were core competent in this aspect, and I can tell you that there are not. There are a few best-in-class examples, but they are really quite few. So we are not lacking with any sobering reminders of the amount of risk or disruption within our supply chain. There are, however, unique things that we can do to better our capabilities around risk management and choose to mitigate the right risks. Hopefully some of the ideas that we shared with you will give you a little bit of a flavor for that. And of course, if you have any additional questions, both Brian and myself are available to help to answer them. Thank you for your attention.